Welcome to Is It the Podcast? From Rembrandt to Rubens, from Van Dyck to Van Eyck, each episode examines an artwork with an uncertain authorship, in dialogue with a leading guest expert. We'll tell the story of the artist we suspect created the work, of the work in question, and then we reveal the results of a cutting-edge AI authentication analysis performed by the Swiss firm Art Recognition. I'm your host, Professor Noah Charney. So, is it? Today's episode is a special one. It's called Is It a Bronzino? But it really could be called Is It an Allori? We'll get to that in a moment. But first, Bronzino. Bronzino is my favorite painter. I've had a poster of Bronzino's London Allegory of Love and Lust in my dorm room since boarding school. That's the painting about which I wrote one of my master's theses, and it's the puzzle picture that got me interested in iconography, the study of symbols in art. So I'm a Bronzino groupie, and it turns out my special guest is too. He's written on Bronzino, he's curated exhibitions, and he's published on one of Bronzino's most famous subjects portrayed, Eleonora of Toledo, the wife of Cosimo de Medici. And it's a portrait of Eleonora of Toledo that's the subject of this episode. It's even greater kismet since my elder daughter is named Eleonora, and our specialist from Art Recognition is likewise a Bronzino fan and has lived in Florence. The stars have aligned today. Joining us from Art Recognition is Alessandra Conti. Alessandra is an art historian specializing in early modern art and visual culture, with particular emphasis on iconography. She studied and worked in Milan, Pisa, London, and Zurich, completing degrees in cultural studies and art history in a global context. She has held teaching positions in Milan, Florence, and Rome within the field of visual studies. And currently she serves as art historical researcher at Art Recognition, where her work engages with AI-assisted research, attribution studies, and the evolving methodological dialogue between connoisseurship and emerging technologies. And our special guest today is Bruce Edelstein, an art historian specializing in Renaissance and Baroque art with particular emphasis on Italian painting, patronage, and the history of collecting. He's studied and worked extensively in the United States and Italy, and has long been based in Florence, where he has taught art history to generations of students in the city's museums, churches, and historic spaces. He's held academic and research positions connected to the study of early modern visual culture, and is known for combining close visual analysis with deep historical context. Currently, he's affiliated with New York University in Florence, where he teaches and researches Italian art and its cultural setting. So let's get this Bronzino and Eleonora love fest together. All of us have a history of teaching in Florence. All of us love Bronzino, and we are very much curious to find out whether the painting in question is a Bronzino or is it an Allori. Well, let's dive in and find out. So thank you, Bruce and Alessandro, for joining me today for the latest episode of Is It the Podcast? And this is a special episode for a number of reasons. So I'm completely obsessed with Bronzino. I had a poster of Bronzino's Allegory of Love and Lust in my dorm room since boarding school. And I named my elder daughter Eleonora. So there's lots of good connections here. Bruce, can you tell us first, which picture did you select for us to test? Describe it for us and tell us why it was interesting for you.
Okay, so I chose a picture that in many ways I think my students would have considered a trick question, a very difficult picture to think about from the point of view of attribution. It's a portrait of Eleonora de Toledo, who was the second Duchess of Florence and Siena for about 20 years, up until 1562 when she died. And it was the last official image of her that was made by the court painter Agnolo Bronzino. Throughout her reign as Duchess of Florence, Bronzino executed 4 different portrait types of the Duchess. The earliest portrait type depicted her shortly after her marriage to the young Duke Cosimo de Medici. And then there were 2 more official images of her. In each case, she was depicted with one of her sons. So in the first very, very famous portrait of her in the Uffizi, painted by Bronzino, it shows Eleonora together with her second son, Giovanni. This may sound like an unusual choice, but there were good reasons for it. And then subsequently, she was depicted in an updated portrait type that was very extensively replicated in various contexts, sizes, and formats, together with her eldest son, Francesco, who succeeded his father as Duke, later Grand Duke of Tuscany. And then in around 1559, new updated portraits were commissioned of Cosimo, Eleonora's husband, and Eleonora herself. And I have connected them, I think I'm probably not the only person to have done so, with a campaign on the part of Cosimo and Eleonora to get an upgrade to their title. They no longer wanted to be Duke and Duchess of Florence and Siena. They were hoping to become King and Queen of Etruria. They didn't make it quite that far. But the campaign was successful because Cosimo eventually did get his title upgraded to Grand Duke of Tuscany. Eleonora didn't get to enjoy that because she unfortunately died young before that campaign came to its end. So this portrait is absolutely related to this campaign. It was meant to depict Eleonora in a kind of queenly status. And it is the finest of the various versions known of this portrait to survive. So one of the big questions about it is it an autograph portrait by Bronzino, or was it made by someone in his workshop? And the greatest candidate for that was the painter Alessandro Allori, who was not only Bronzino's student, but he was eventually adopted by Bronzino and made a member of his family.
So there's a mystery surrounding this picture, but it's one of several versions of the same picture. Is that right? How many are extant?
So we presume that the first version of this, made by Bronzino, no longer survives. Various adaptations and versions of this picture survive. A well-known version of this is in the National Gallery in Washington, which probably reproduces the original scale of Bronzino's lost original. Which would have been a format somewhat larger than the picture in Berlin. It would have shown the Duchess below her waist down to almost her knees. And this would have made a better match to the known versions of the portrait of her husband that were made at the same time, and would have been more similar to the official portraits that had been made in the 1540s and 1550s of Eleonora, together with her sons. The reason she wasn't depicted with her son at this time was that the sons had now become adults. So the eldest son, Prince Francesco, was an adult. He was at the beginning of a search for an appropriate bride. The second son had been made a cardinal by that date. So they were now the subjects of autonomous, independent portraits as adult figures of themselves. It was no longer appropriate for them to be shown as the children of the Duchess.
No longer holding little baby birds in their hands and what?
No.
So Alessandra, so you're part of the art recognition team, but you're also an Italian art historian, and you were already familiar with Bronzino and Allori before you got this picture to examine. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm actually originally from Florence, and I was born there and raised there. But then as soon as I had the legal age to leave, I did. But I go back quite often. One of the occasions was for Bruce exhibition. I returned it on purpose to see the exhibition because I couldn't miss it. And my fascination with Bronzino started with his ability of rendering garments mainly, which is my research focus at the moment, history of costume, dresses. And Bronzino played a big part in it, as he was one of the most important artists related to the ability of rendering textiles, as we know by the example given of Eleonora portrait at the Uffizi Gallery.
So this was actually very fortuitous. I'm not used to, normally when we have someone from the art recognition team, they're like, yeah, I'll examine this picture, but they don't have that personal connection with the artist we're testing.
Yeah, actually, I started to study more broadly early modern art history in Milan, where I study with Giovanni Agosti, who has been my mentor so far. And I sort of felt very fascinated with the history, mainly with Pontormo first and Bronzino after. And I think that is a very complex period to study very intense in the meaning that the proliferation of artists in Florence during the 16th century is immense. And obviously, we are concentrating our interest to the main one, Bronzino, Allori, or Pontormo, but there are many others, 100 others.
Maybe you could explain for us, Bruce. People tend to not be familiar with the bottega system and the fact that there can be a number of artists who are really intimately related professionally, sometimes socially as well, and how it can be difficult to unpick who made what when. Could you maybe talk a little bit about the Allori, Pontormo, and Bronzino dynamic and why it makes for tricky questions like this?
Sure. But first of all, I want to say thank you to Alessandra. I'm very honored that you traveled specifically to see the exhibition that I mounted at the Uffizi in 2023 for the 500th anniversary, presumed, of Eleonora's birth, which was a remarkable occasion. We had almost 110 objects that recounted the story of her life, including actual textile samples and garments, and 3 of the 4 portraits, including the one that we're having this conversation about. We are having a conversation also about something very central to art history, at least from the beginning of the 20th century, which is connoisseurship. That is the analysis of pictures to decide who the author is. But in some ways, connoisseurship is very much complicated by the workshop system for 15th and 16th century paintings made in Florence and elsewhere, because the workshop system did not presume that a single artist would execute entirely a single work of art. We have many famous examples of collaboration in the execution of paintings. One particularly famous one in Florence, of course, is Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ, in which we see the not quite so young, already very proficient Leonardo da Vinci also lending his hand to the execution of the painting. And part of what connoisseurship for this period means is trying to pick out how much of an artist's hand might be on a particular picture. In many ways, we shouldn't really presume that anything made in this period is made by a sole author. Although we may have more to say about this in regard to this particular picture that we're talking about. And connoisseurship is complicated, I think, by its intimate relationship with the art market. So the art market wants single authors. And this is a result of the ideas about authorship that were developed in the 19th century during the Romantic period, a kind of heroic vision of the artist, imagined working alone. And for the market, having a single name associated with a work of art is extremely important. But for 15th and 16th century Italian pictures, that's very, very rarely the case. And in this particular group of artists that we are talking about, they have a very intimate family relationship. This has been beautifully analyzed a number of years ago in a wonderful book by a friend and colleague, Elizabeth Pilliard, who really reconstructed Pontormo, Bronzino, and Allori's relationship as a family unit. And in many ways it was. In the workshop system, you typically entered into an apprenticeship at around the age of 12 or 13. And that system is somewhat breaking down in the period that we're talking about. We don't really have the same control exerted by the guilds that we have in the 15th century towards the middle of the 16th century. It will eventually be replaced by the foundation of the first surviving arts academy, the Accademia delle Arti del Disegno, which still exists in Florence. And Pontormo, in many ways, although he didn't participate in the founding of that, was so important to the identity of artists in Florence that when they founded the academy and obtained a chapel for the burial of its members, they moved Pontormo's body from where it had been buried to the new chapel dedicated to the academy. And the workshop system was also very much around the idea that when you were being trained to imitate your master's style so successfully that nobody would recognize the distinction between the way you painted and the way your master painted. So this creates a lot of confusion, especially in these kinds of transitional moments in which someone hasn't emerged from the workshop and is collaborating with the master. The point would be to make your works as similar as possible to what the master does. So we have complicated issues of attribution between Pontormo and the young Bronzino, and then later on the same thing happens with Bronzino and Allori.
So, Alessandra, I understand that this was a trickier than usual task for you and the team because you really had to teach the AI system the work of more than one artist to get the answers we were looking for. Can you talk us through basically how you did it? What's the approach in a step-by-step way for training the AI and why it was trickier for this work than with others in the past?
Well, firstly, it's very important to have a strong bibliography, which in this case we have on both sides. Unfortunately, we don't have the privilege of having a catalog raisonné for Bronzino, but we have the one by Simona Lecchini Giovannoni regarding Alessandro Allori, which was the base for the research on that particular artist. Regarding Agnolo Bronzino, I have personally read everything written almost from Vasari to Bruce writing also, I have to say again, and the latest article, for example, from the Consistorici Institute in Florence. So when we do not have a catalog raisonné on artists that we work, and I can speak in general, obviously the research is longer because there is a longer list of bibliography that need to be studied. In this case, we decided to approach the topic a bit differently. So the dataset was built with authentic works by Bronzino and Allori only. So we didn't include, for example, the related artist, as we wanted to have a result related to the probability of the work to be by one or the other artist involved in the research. But that's not simpler in the meaning that there are many portraits attributed to Bronzino, which have been contested for multiple reasons with a very problematic attribution history, so they cannot definitely be included in a project like this. So the data set is obviously smaller, and this is a bit, I will say, a challenge for a project related to AI in relation to early modern art, which is one of the most difficult topics to be analyzed.
So it's a matter of teaching the AI each new artist who you want it to test against. And if someone asks you, like even for this podcast series, we've tested twice so far for Van Eyck for different episodes. But if it's a new artist like Allori or Bronzino who you hadn't yet developed a data set for, you have to really do it from scratch. And it starts with, old-fashioned art historical research, ideally beginning with a catalog raisonné. And then you also do some things like negative image testing and generating intentionally AI-generated images to teach the AI what not to be fooled by. And that's an aspect that I find interesting. Can you tell a little bit about basically, you're teaching it what to recognize, but you're also teaching it what not to be fooled by.
Yes, because AI works like the human eye, so they need to be able to understand what is correct and what is not correct. To do so, synthetic images sometimes are also used in the dataset, and by synthetic images, I mean images generated by AI models that generate imagery. Usually, the process is or by a translation image by image, and they reproduce a third image, or even with a language model. So you insert a description and they produce an image related to the description that you have written.
So maybe now's a good time for you to reveal the results of the test. And then I want to hear Bruce's analysis of it, because I'm personally curious because I'm such a big fan of these artists in question. So Alessandra, is it a Bronzino? Or is it an Allori? I don't even know what we're going to call this episode. Or is it by both of them?
Well, there is a 69% probability that the work is by Allori with our training dataset, which is an interesting result. It's actually confirming what I have studied on Giovannoni's catalog raisonné. But I would like also to ask Bruce his opinion on this prediction.
Maybe, Bruce, before you jump in, just to clarify, because I always want to know the answer to this. When you say 69%, I understand that in general, if it's over 60%, it's quite a compelling result. But when you say 69%, what does that mean in practice? And then I want to pass the mic over to you, Bruce.
Well, there is like a kind of very high probability that was painted by Allori in this case. But as the training was done in between Bronzino and Allori, there is still around a 30% probability that the work was also painted by Bronzino.
Could it mean that it was mostly painted by Allori and partially painted by Bronzino? Is that the way the percentages can work?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Or it could mean that it was Allori's version of a Bronzino original that we don't have anymore. That is another way to interpret the analysis.
I think that the first option that you just described is the most
okay. Very interesting. Bruce, what do you think about this?
Well, I have to say, one of the reasons I asked for this to be the picture that we analyzed and talked about is that when I was writing the catalog for my show, I had to deal with the question of the attribution, obviously, in order to write the catalog entry. And scholars that I respect deeply have argued both sides of this question. They've even quite recently, it's been reattributed to Bronzino in important catalogs of exhibitions. So this is a big open question in the field. Is it a Bronzino? Is it an Allori? So I muddled through this question for quite some time and really thought about it. And I ultimately came in on behalf of Allori, having executed this particular version of this painting. We know without a doubt, because Vasari tells us so, that the type of portrait that we're talking about, the original from which the various versions would have been generated, was painted by Bronzino. I have no doubt about that. So the concept behind this picture was Bronzino's. What happens with these paintings, and this is a particular problem in the area of portraiture, because the portraits were intended to be replicated in many copies in various formats. This is something that they have developed over the course of the period in which Eleonora was Duchess. She arrives in a city that has only been recently turned from a republic into a hereditary noble state. And the first Duke of Florence didn't last very long before he was assassinated by one of his cousins. So he didn't really have time to develop a court. Eleonora plays a fundamental role in assisting her husband in establishing a court, and how they use art is essential to how they create this identity and how they promote it, especially abroad. So it's really during their reign that they develop a whole kind of system for how to make portraits. Portraits were made typically in a 3/4 length format. And then replicas were made either of the full portrait. So, for example, there are full-scale replicas of the portrait of Eleonora in the Uffizi in other museums in America and elsewhere. And then there are replicas on other scales. So there could be bust-length replicas, like the painting we're talking about in Berlin, in which the painting descends below the neck and the hands are raised up into the picture in order to be able to include them as an expressive part of the body. And then there is the smallest format, which is typically referred to in Italian as the Gioviana, because Cosimo, Eleonora's husband, sent another member of Bronzino's workshop to live in the home of Paolo Giovio, who had created the greatest collection of portraits in Italy at that time, just to make replicas of their faces. And the Medici themselves produce replicas of the faces of the portraits they commission for the purposes of making gifts of them or for including them in other places. So what happens? You, depending upon who you are, if you were going to be the recipient of one of the copies of one of these pictures, you would either get the full 3/4 length, you would get the kind of half length with the hands, or you would just get the head, depending upon your status. And how much of the master's hand was in these replicas was also one of the signs of favor towards a particularly important recipient of one of these gifts. And this picture is particularly problematic because it's so fine. It's such a beautiful painting. It's so beautifully painted that we're unlikely to attribute it generically to Bronzino's workshop or to one of the lesser members of the workshop itself. And this is why scholars have really gathered around either attributing the picture to Bronzino himself or to his finest pupil, who was Alessandro Allori. Now, in the period in which he would have painted this, Allori had he had spent some time in Rome. He left Bronzino's workshop. He went to Rome. He met Michelangelo. And he came back as an autonomous artist who had already had significant commissions in Rome and was receiving important commissions in Florence on his own. So he now has his own workshop. But unusually, he also collaborates with the workshop of his former master, who's his adoptive father. They have a very special relationship. And that's one of the reasons why we can hypothesize that this painting may have been painted by Allori. Now, the big question is collaboration. And I have to say, I would normally have taken this scientific analysis, this news that we've just been given, and embraced wholeheartedly the idea that this was a picture that Allori executed in Bronzino's workshop using a cartoon derived from his original picture, but then Bronzino also participated in finishing it off. But that doesn't seem likely in this particular case because I've had access to other kinds of information about the picture. When I was studying it, the curator in Berlin kindly shared with me other kinds of scientific photography. So I've seen an X-ray of the picture. I've seen an infrared reflectogram. And I've also seen an image of what the picture looks like under ultraviolet light. So under these different ranges of light, we see different things. They are fundamental, I think, to the work of the connoisseur today. I think connoisseurs who are working without the benefit of this kind of scientific photography are really thrashing around in the dark. They're not taking advantage of everything that's available to us. And I think this is what our hope for artificial intelligence is, that it will contribute to our understanding of these paintings in the way that, especially in my field, infrared reflectograms have contributed, because I work on panel paintings. I work with artists who drew a lot. And so the IR imagery has really contributed enormously to our understanding of their artistic process, but also helps a lot in making attribution. And in this particular case, what I saw in the infrared didn't give me what I was hoping for when I was hoping to weigh in on the side of Bronzino for the picture. So what do we know about Bronzino from infrared reflectography? We know that Bronzino is an artist who drew a lot after he had finished his compositions. So he makes changes, enormous changes, typically, before completing the first version of one of these portraits. Some of them have remarkable changes underneath the surface. And that's what I would expect to see from Bronzino. Instead, what I was able to see in the IR image of this particular picture, where you could make out the underdrawing, it looked very carefully traced, which suggests the use of a cartoon. And there we enter into what seems much more likely to be executed by someone in the workshop following the design of the master. And it did not appear from these kinds of ranges of light that there was more than one hand at work on this particular panel. So my estimation is that it was likely executed by a single artist. And you've given me wonderful support for the idea that that artist is likely to be Allori. But I don't respond to the idea that it's 60-something% likely to be Allori as a suggestion that in this particular case, this was a collaboration.
That's really helpful, Bruce. And it's always nice when a new technological advance matches with what the traditional art historian thinks. So that's always good when everyone's in sync. It's a good thing. It's really interesting when you're talking about the multispectral imaging, because we're doing a project newly with Maurizio Serracini, who you probably know since you're in Florence, to basically be the first AI image analysis company to compare multispectral images as well as the surface. So what art recognition does now, of course, is the surface, what we see on the surface. But you need an extensive database of images of the multispectral light versions of works of art to be able to train the AI to recognize what an underdrawing or what an infrared reflectogram should look like. And that's the plan now with Serracini, because he actually has all those images. And he has it not for every artist, but for a lot of them. We haven't gotten there yet. We just started working with him recently, but that's the plan. And it's quite exciting because all of a sudden you can go quite literally a level deeper than anyone's been able to go before. And hopefully the capability of AI to see some things that the human eye might not can then be used comparing these multispectral images as well as the surface. So this is to be stay tuned because we're really at the cutting edge at the moment.
In fact, one of the challenges for art historians who do have access to multispectral images for a single artwork may not have access to good comparative images. More and more museums are publishing images on their websites, following conservation campaigns of works of art, but it's not something that has been universally shared, and it makes for an enormous challenge in being able to understand what it is that we're looking at.
So, Alessandra, this is really good when the discovery we make is in perfect sync with what our art historian guest has thought. And we've actually had good luck so far in this series that it's been pretty consistently like that. I'm curious your thoughts as a fan of Allori and Bronzino. What do you make of this yourself personally as an Italian art historian from Florence? And maybe the bigger question I'm asking is, as an art historian, does it matter to you who is the author of the work if it emerged from Bronzino's workshop the way it would matter to the art market?
Well, that's a very good question. I was thinking about it before starting today, and how the art market is, as Bruce said, pushing to have a painting attributed to an artist or another. And from my perspective, it doesn't really matter, in the meaning that it's important to understand the art historical context, but in some cases to try to pinpoint an artwork to an artist instead of another is a waste of time in my perspective.
But this is, I'm not supposed to say it's a waste of time because that's the theme of this podcast series, but it's really just an excuse for us to have interesting discussions. But one of the things that there is a debate that I've had with Serracini is he has a distinction between two terms that we use interchangeably in casual conversation. One is authenticity and one is attribution. And material forensic analysis is good at authenticating something. So this came from Florence, I don't know, circa 1545 or whatever you like, and that it's materially from the correct age and location. And so that is authentic to the period in question, but it doesn't tell us who made it. And that's the separate question. That's the attribution question. And I think too often we confuse the two. And what we need to do is obviously have the ideal combination. I keep going back and forth trying to come up with a good analogy. I'm not sure if it's a chair, a table, or a stool, but we have multiple legs to it. And the oldest form of art history is connoisseurship, so expert opinion. And then we have provenance research as another leg. And then we had added material forensics as a third leg. And now we have this AI image analysis as a fourth one. And ideally, we have to have all four of them covered to have the deepest possible consideration and information available about a work to both authenticate it and attribute it to an artist. But I think you're right also from my perspective. If it came from Bronzino's workshop, I'm not particularly bothered if Bronzino did all or part of it, but we have this tendency, I think partly it's Vasari's fault, or at least the way he was embraced in the Romantic period, where the idea of this artist as a single genius dressed in all black, smoking cigarettes and drinking absinthe in a Paris apartment, that concept of the single artistic genius has altered the way we think about art in a way that it simply didn't exist until really the 19th century. And so we're superimposing this idea that there's a lone genius out there who paints everything from top to bottom. And then it inhibits the way we think about earlier periods, which I get from a market perspective. But from the perspective of fans like us, I like that it's a point of departure to discuss the topic, but I think that the answer is less important than at least the market would lead us to believe.
Certainly in the case of the market, saying that something is by Alessandro Allori and saying that something is by Agnolo Bronzino would have a significant effect on the economic value of a picture. Ironically, this is probably the reverse of what it would have been in the 19th century, when Allori was more famous and more sought after by, say, British collectors traveling through Italy on the Grand Tour. And their understanding of who these artists were was also very, very different than what we have today. But, I think it is important. I think connoisseurship is still a central element of art history. I would maybe contest that it's the first part. I think the very first form of art history was probably ekphrasis.
Okay. Can you actually explain that to the listener, Bruce? Because I know what you mean, but I'd be guessing 0.1% of the listeners know what you mean. But I agree with you as soon as you said it. But can you just briefly tell what you mean by that?
In its simplest form, it's about translating a work of art into words. So describing effectively a work of art, although ekphrasis was in ancient times also a form of poetry. So they were poetic transpositions inspired by the vision of a work of art. But we think of it, I think, in its most basic form as creating an effective description in words of what it is that we're looking at. And that may or may not be something that AI will contribute in a significant way to changing the way we do. But I think it's one of the most important early exercises. It's how we also know that we're all talking about the same thing when we're talking about a work of art, is how we describe it. So if you recognize a work of art that you're looking at from the words that I've used to describe it, then you know we're on the same page to start with as a basis for our conversation.
Wasn't there also something of a competitive element that my poetic version is better than your painted version? And then that comes up in the Ut Pictura Poesis Paragone debates in 16th century Florentine society?
It certainly does. And I currently teach a course on the history of art criticism. And it's been very interesting to see how those debates, which were so central in 15th and 16th century Florence, continued to be central in 19th century London. And they kind of never really go away, that artists felt compelled, even well into the Romantic period, to justify their status based on a competition with poets.
So this is going to sound funny, but one of my master's theses, which is on Bronzino's allegory, my idea was that this was his painted response to Benedetto Varchi asking his opinion about which is the superior art form, sculpture, poetry, or painting. And he wrote in a letter to Varchi, "I'd rather paint you an answer than write one." And so part of my thesis was that he decided, I'm going to paint an answer to this question. And so he painted something that intentionally would be completely impossible to sculpt and probably impossible to write a poem about. So I don't know if that's still of any relevance, 100 years later, but I was certainly thinking about it when you mentioned it.
Well, Bronzino was a remarkable poet in addition to being a fantastic painter. He was probably of the poet artists of the 16th century in Italy, probably second only to Michelangelo. And Bronzino was a founding member of the Florentine Literary Academy. And together with other artists, when that academy was co-opted by the Duke of Florence, Cosimo, he was thrown out, but he was the only artist who was let back in subsequently. So it says something about how he was recognized also, not just as a painter, but also as a poet. He was deeply committed to his poetic activity. And it's something I think we feel in his paintings, a kind of literary sophistication, certainly in the allegories, which required a deep understanding not only of classical imagery, but of classical text. They were paintings that were meant to inspire. They were conversation pieces. They were meant to inspire sophisticated people to compete with each other in trying to decipher their complicated and not transparent imagery.
This was a perfect episode. Thank you so much. What a treat to speak with both of you. And I love that we have a virtual room full of Bronzino fans. Alessandra, thank you for bringing your enthusiasm and expertise in not only the technical side, but also the art history. And Bruce, thank you for championing the Bronzino banner. I'm all about Team Bronzino. We need to get him out there more. So thanks so much to you both for being my guests today.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
What a fun episode full of love for Florence, Eleonora, Bronzino, and a shared interest in deepening our understanding of the story of art. Thanks for listening to Is It? The Podcast. This series is produced by Urshka Charney, presented by Noah Charney, and is brought to you by Art Recognition. Based in Zurich, Art Recognition is the leading firm for AI-driven authentication of artworks. Featured everywhere from the art newspaper to Wired to The Guardian and beyond, Art Recognition uses the most definitive, sophisticated datasets and advanced processes to estimate the likelihood that a specific artist created an artwork. Backed by a multidisciplinary team that takes many dimensions of research into consideration, art recognition has a long track record of success at the highest level. Learn more at art-recognition.com. That's art-recognition.com. We'll be back next time with a new art historical mystery, a new possible artist behind the masterpiece, and a new guest expert. See you next time.